Thrill Me.
This show is part of the Thrill Me Podcast Network. Experience more on Facebook and YouTube.
Hey, what's going on? This is Thomas Nicholas. Welcome to the Metal Groove with your host, Tombstone Josh.
So, you like heavy metal?
What's up, everybody, and welcome into an all-new episode of the Metal Groove Podcast. That's right. Thank you guys so much for checking in with me this week on a topic that I think should be a lot of fun. And hey, it makes a lot of sense for this time of year. I mean, it's springtime. We got that poison pixie dust, aka pollen, is in the air. And what else happens around springtime? That's right. It's March Madness season. Me personally, I'm a big sports fan. I've been doing these little brackets for a while now. And the idea I had for this show actually has been cooking for a couple weeks now. But I wanted to wait and release it so that it made a little bit more sense because it is March Madness week. It's kind of like a March Madness breakdown. And I'll get into all of that. It makes sense, but it doesn't make sense. But anyways, welcome into the show, everybody. My name is Josh. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Let's have some fun, man. Let's talk about some rock and roll music. Let's have some fun. Let's make a decision. And this idea for my show is really, just kind of what I have going on inside my brain. I'm going to use a little bit of analytics, going to use a little bit of data here to try and push my narrative, I guess. But what I really need from this episode is feedback. I need to know, once we get towards the end of the show, I'll dive into it a little bit more. But I really want some feedback on this particular show, this particular voting. And then we'll go from there, man. So like I said, thank you guys so much for tuning in, and let's have a lot of fun. All right, so today I'm going to try to decide which decade was the best for producing rock music in a bracket-style rundown. That's my goal. That's what we're trying to achieve today. And I'm not going to do matchups because I think music can be subjective, right? Just because a band is my favorite doesn't mean it's your favorite. It might not be a band you've heard of. Maybe I haven't heard of a band that you would think is the best. It's all subjective. A band per se isn't what I'm going with to make or decide a winner. Now, my final four at the end is going to say something different, but I'm looking at strength of region, and I'm using my air quotes because they use regions in the basketball tournament for March Madness. So right there, that's the idea. We're going to go by decades. All right, the first hurdle that I came across with this decision was the amount of decades. In a normal March Madness setup, there are 4 regions, right? Well, here I have 6 decades. We have the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, and then the 2010s. So I'm going to combine a few of those because of crossover, really. Like, there's some bands that are going to cross over through each decade, and there's some bands that's been around the whole damn time. But I'm just going to try and pinpoint certain decades that these bands seem to be the strongest, or maybe they stand out in my opinion. There's so many great rock bands. Like, for example, in the 2010s, 2000s, I'm not putting Skillet in my bracket. Like I said, this is subjective. I'm not going to put what I think are lame bands into my bracket. So if you like them, I'm sorry. I apologize. But I'm going to go with great rock bands throughout each decade. And after saying that, I'm going to go ahead and combine the 60s and the 70s. That's going to be one region. Okay? The 80s will be all by themselves. The 90s will be all by themselves. And then I'm going to combine the 2000s and the 2010s. So those make up our 4 regions, okay? The 60s, 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and then the 2000s as a whole, I guess you could say. All right, next order of business. Who would be the number 1 seed for each region? That's a tough one. That's a tough decision, right? And like I said, some of these bands spanned many decades. But when did they get their most oomph? When were they at their strongest? And one of these is debatable. One of these I have as a number 1 seed. You could say that they were at their strongest through 3 decades. But I'd put them down for one specific decade because I think that's when they were at their strongest. Like I said, this is subjective. You can argue with me. That's what I'm here for. Debates make things fun. But anyways, here are my choices. For the 60s, 70s region, my number 1 scene is going to be Led Zeppelin. Great start, right? Great rock and roll band. They kind of just encapsulate what 70s rock and roll was. Not 60s, but I feel like they're the strongest band to come from that region. I'm going to dive into those bands in a second. All right, for the 80s, I'm going to go with Metallica. I feel like Metallica, not only did they get their start in the 80s, but they put out a lot of great material in the 80s. And they're that band I was talking about that has spanned many, many decades of just great music. So, but I'm going to put them in the 80s region. 90s, I mean, hell, when you think 90s music, 90s rock and roll, the first band that comes to probably everybody's mind is Nirvana. So they felt like the number one runaway seed for me for the 90s. I'm going to dive into those bands in a little bit as well, and you'll see where I'm going here. All right, 2000s, little bit of a biased pick. There's a couple bands I could go with here that just have strong cases for being the best band of this era of current rock and roll. But for me, 2000s, I'm going to go with the Foo Fighters. A lot of these were tough decisions, like trying to pick a number one seed for the 60s and 70s when you have the Beatles and Led Zeppelin both in there. I mean, also the crossover was tough to determine which band was at their best. It's all subjective, like I've said 100 times already. So don't get too mad at me here. But below, I found a breakdown of decades and bands that represented that I will go through. And then we'll just kind of come to this conclusion at the end. So just follow me here. Stay with me. And please feel free to contribute and yell at me or agree with me or disagree with me. That's what I'm here for. All right, before we dive in, let's get the business stuff taken care of. Right now, you are locked in, strapped in, loaded, and listening to the Thrill Me Podcast Network. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Please make sure that you like, you follow, you subscribe on whatever your favorite streaming platform is, man. We cover all things pop culture. We have a great range of fun shows for you to check out. I mean, just come on over, join the fun, look up Thrill Me Podcast Network. And as far as this show, any likes, reviews, follows, any and all support is greatly appreciated, man. And like I say every time, I love you guys. I love talking rock and roll music with you. Thank you for being here. Be a friend, tell a friend, help my show grow. It's appreciated. So, all right. Okay, diving back, let's travel to the 60s. And then we'll work our way up. And then we'll kind of shape how this bracket is going to go. The 1960s was kind of a rough decade that saw the rise of many famous rock bands. During that time, bands such as the Beatles, the Rolling Stones became some of history's most successful and legendary artists, man. These are a few of the most popular rock bands from the 1960s, and these bands helped shape, rock music sound and influence a lot of future musicians. So we got the Beatles, Rolling Stones, the Beach Boys, the Doors, the Grateful Dead, Jimi Hendrix. I mean, come on, the Jimi Hendrix experiment was just remarkable. Janis Joplin, influence, inspiration for so many female singers and female rockers growing up, man. So her band, Janis Joplin, and the Big Brother and the Holding Company was a big part of the 60s rock and roll scene. Jefferson Airplane, Pink Floyd, The Who, and how could you leave out Creedence Clearwater Revival, little CCR. I know my brother Rob, he's been digging that band lately. So that's a run of 60s bands. They're pretty big during that time, man. So Through Music from the 60s was released a long time ago. Their sound is still popular, man. A lot of people remember these artists as some of the greatest rock bands of all time. The groundbreaking contributions of these bands continue to inspire people today. They defined an era and changed the course of popular music. Okay, so you can already see right there, I would pull a couple of bands from those 60s to complete a region, but not all of them. Not all of them are going to make the cut as far as the best of the best when it comes to breaking down the 60s and the 70s. Speaking of, moving on to the 70s, just to round out this region, the 1970s gave rock fans a new type of sound that was kind of more blues and folk infused after, the previous decades, psychedelic sounds, melodies, kind of things Beatles had going on. The focus was more on songwriting, storytelling. The 1970s brought a focus on more rock bands rather than solo artists. The result created some of the most crucial bands in rock history. Influences from 1970s rock and roll remain in the modern era. You could see it sprinkled all over the place. While the hair might be shorter and the facial hair a little bit cleaner, these rock bands from the 70s showed everyone what it took to sell albums and spawn rock favorites to stand the test of time. And like I said, there's going to be a little bit of crossover here. But when it comes to the 70s, we're looking at bands like number one seed, Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd's back, Fleetwood Mac, AC/DC, Leonard Skinner, Queen, Kansas, Kiss, Boston, Aerosmith, Van Halen had their start in the 70s, Black Sabbath, ZZ Top, the Eagles, Rush. I mean, we have so many strong bands in the 70s. It could make up its own region, but I had to squish some in there because you can't just leave the 60s out. They're a part of rock and roll history, man. These iconic bands and songs have truly stood the test of time, and they make up a very impressive lineup. Think of them as the ACC of basketball championships. Think of Duke. You think of North Carolina. Those are the people that are always in the running, the blue bloods, if you will. So that's the way I kind of like to look at that region. Fantastic start, right? We're kicking this thing off in great fashion. Next up is the 1980s. Excess is the word best used to describe the 1980s. From the economy to the politics to the entertainment and rock and roll, the excess of the 1980s proved larger-than-life personalities always received attention. That said, rock bands continued to evolve past the rock legends of the 70s. Some of their legendary bands continued their success into the next decade even, with bands like Motley Crue, Bon Jovi, Van Halen still in there, Kiss still in there. Personal favorite of mine, Guns N' Roses, Metallica, #1 seed like I talked about earlier. We got Journey, you got Judas Priest, you got Iron Maiden, Tom Petty was kicking in the 80s. Def Leppard, Poison, Aerosmith still there, Rat, Skid Row, R.E.M., Heart, just make up an incredible lineup of its own. This is why the 80s is its own region. This list of rock bands of the 80s, like I said, Metallica, Guns N' Roses, Motley Crue, showed the evolution of hard rock from the 70s, breaking the genre into its own mainstream popularity. Sold out arenas and world tours were the norm during this decade. To count yourself lucky if you managed to see any of these acts during that period was like transcendent. It kind of like was a movement of time in that era to go see an arena rock band at an actual arena rock show. A little bit before my time. I wish I was a part of it, man. But still, plenty of rock's biggest bands of the 80s continue to tour, offering old and new fans an opportunity to rock out just like it was 1984 again. Justin, the Mindful, and the acid-wash jeans of it all, the over-teased hair, those were never coming back into style, but the music has stayed true, man. I mean, some of that style is kind of coming back around. But anyways, this is the region I like to think of as the SEC. There's a few heavy hitters that came along and really put a massive stamp on the landscape. There's a few bands people would consider duds in there. Hey, I understand. That's why I said this is subjective. I'm probably going to say that a couple more times, man. But for the most part, another group of iconic bands that just put out great music. And, you know, that's why its own region. It's strong as a whole, as its own. And I could have listed a whole lot more, man, but we only get a little bit per region. Okay, moving on to the 90s. This is the decade that I grew up in. This is kind of where my musical taste started to hit me. It's not exactly what I wanted to listen to all the time, but this is where I really started to listen to music. You know, got my first drum set in the 90s, kind of where I started to play music, pay a little bit more attention to it. But the 90s rock scene paved the way for some of the most influential subgenres of rock music to date. During this time, many artists began changing their sound following the previous decade's success with power ballads, while others were just getting to their start the road to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I mean, sounds like grunge, nu metal, pop punk became the genres to listen to, and somewhat surprisingly became staples in the rock subgenres. Rock music became a fantastic mashup of different sounds throughout the decade that had a resounding effect on the generation. And you could feel that all over the place in the 90s. You have, you know, like stuff like Nine Inch Nails, stuff like Soundgarden, Blink-182, Green Day. All of these kind of different sounds were spawning and starting. Korn, I think you consider them 90s whenever they were first starting out. So there's a lot of different sounds going in the 90s that just kind of made this jarble of cool, interesting, powerful rock bands, man. So let's go through the list right now. The 90s brought many phenomenal new sounds to the rock music genre. Many of these bands became household favorites and iconic inspirations for new age rock moving into the early 2000s and even in the modern day. We're talking about bands like Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, Stone Temple Pilots, Radiohead, Weezer, Alice in Chains, the Red Hot Chili Peppers, No Doubt, U2, Green Day, Smashing Pumpkins, Offspring, Pantera, Bush. I mean, the 90s were a phenomenal just kind of cauldron of different sounds, but still producing great music, man. The 90s is a region of its own because of this case. And I like to think of this as the Big East of the tournament. I mean, you've heard of most of these bands, and they've all been very successful when it comes to album sales and remaining popular to this day. Just producing popular music that stands the test of time is what it's all about, man. Okay, to round out the regions, I'm combining all of the 2000s, which is a random group of bands, actually. Whenever I started to look into it and dive into album sales and then who was around and who was popular during the last 20 years of music, it's hard to believe it's been 20 years since the 2000s kicked off. I forgot some of these bands became as big as they were, man. The 2000s produced some of the greatest rock bands the world has ever seen. And, you know, some, like I said, that crossover earlier. We got your Green Day, your Red Hot Chili Peppers that just continue to kick out classic songs that people still listen to this day are from that period, man. From the 90s to the 2000s. The Spawn, the crossover is influential, man. It's awesome, man. From angsty lyrics to epic guitar riffs, emo music, new metal was still kicking. These bands have it all. The 2000s was a prime time for many rock bands to flourish. Each one, in one way or another, changed the music world forever. Some of them were pioneers, while others were redefined to their particular genre. And going through the list of popular bands from the 2000s to pretty much now is a pretty crazy list, man. You think about all the different sounds, different things going on. It's pretty interesting. But Red Hot Chili Peppers, Linkin Park, Avenged Sevenfold, Nickelback, Maroon 5, U2, The Killers, All American Rejects, Foo Fighters, Disturbed, Paramore, Green Day, Blink-182, Sum 41, Slipknot, Imagine Dragons, Coldplay. I hate that I had to limit it, but I went kind of by album sales and popularity because I could have put so many more into this region, but the 2000s has been a pretty iconic decade for rock and roll. I mean, you could say that pop music and R&B music, rap music kind of took over in the 90s and spawned into the early 2000s, maybe mid 2000s. But rock and roll music has put a nice little foot down and has kind of grabbed a good strong hold on what current music. I mean, current music actually, everything is popular. Everything is popular right now because you can listen to what you want to whenever you want to. You're not just limited to what's on the radio. So, but rock and roll music in the 2000s, long story short, has been phenomenal, man. I'm sure I've missed some bands in some decades. I mean, I know Korn, Fall Out Boy, Breaking Benjamin, Deep Purple, many, many more could be represented. Like I said, I just put my list together based on popularity at their time, strength at their time, in my opinion, and then album sales. If this was truly a band versus band bracket, there could be upsets all over the place. I mean, the winner could come from any region. Talent versus talent is a hard thing to judge. I mean, could Van Halen win it all? Of course they could. Could Soundgarden win as a Cinderella team? Absolutely. So I tried to take that part out of it and just do a group of bands as a whole. And that's what I did just now. I broke it down. I picked 15 to 16 bands from each region because that's kind of what an NCAA double tournament bracket is. It's 16 teams in each bracket. They play each other to get to the end. And that's kind of what I tried to go for, man. And after looking back at all these bands, thinking of legacy, thinking of power, thinking of just pure amount of influence, inspiration, songwriting, storytelling, impact, still to this day, I think I'm going to choose the 60s and the 70s as the winner of the tournament. That is my region that is the strongest as a whole. There's great bands all across the spectrum, but I feel like, in my opinion, the 60s and the 70s is a runaway winner for the tournament, man. I kept bias out of it because my generation music, what I listen to the most, even still to this day, is the early, is the 80s and then the early 90s. So that's what my bias pick would have been. But the overall power of bands like Led Zeppelin, Van Halen, the Beatles, Aerosmith, Queen, Kiss, and AC/DC just puts the 60s and 70s over the top for me. And like I said earlier, I know there's crossover where some of those bands could be represented in other decades as well. But I'm only focusing on certain bands at certain times. Van Halen in the 70s, Van Halen in the 80s, Van Halen in the 90s. All great music, all powerful piece of landscape music that they put together. So good. Kiss has spanned many decades. Aerosmith has spanned many decades. AC/DC will never die. But just for me, I looked at that as the 70s. And, those bands just put it over the top for me, man. The fact that they were so good for so long is just a testament to how great those bands really were. And that's where we're at, man. So 60s and 70s for me wins it for best decade of rock bands that were produced, that came out, that had their stamp of time. And I feel pretty good about it, man. I went back and forth. I kicked a lot of things around. Like I said, my bias for the 80s was pretty strong. And but yeah, I think I finally wavered and I came to the decision, the 70s. The 70s for me is really what held it up. Because the 60s, if it was only the 60s, I probably wouldn't have gone with it. But I think it's the two groups as a whole, influence-wise, just crush it, man. They've done, I feel like everything that's been great about rock and roll music has been sparked from those 2 decades. All right, if I had to put together a final 4, including upsets, hey, like if I was to put this band to band, now this is not included. I've already made my decision for this week's topic as far as best decade, but I just wanted to make it a little bit more fun. This is where I'm going to give some of my biased opinions here, and this is where I would love some feedback because I'm going to give a final 4. I would love to hear your final 4 bands and who you would have as the winner, man. But if I had to put together a final 4, including upsets and my bias, I think it would be Led Zeppelin, Guns N' Roses, Pearl Jam, and the Foo Fighters. With the Foo Fighters and Led Zeppelin meeting in the final, and then Led Zeppelin eventually coming out on top. They're not my favorite band of all time. That's just how I see it going face to face, if that makes any sense, man. So yeah, please let me know what your picks would be. You see how I had a couple number 1 seeds get in there? I feel like Pearl Jam snuck in there from the 90s. I feel like they had enough power. I feel like they had enough influence. I feel like they had enough great songs over the course of their tenure to slide in there. And I know they kind of have some controversies going on right now with their album sales or their ticket sales or their ticket prices. But hey, that's them. Has nothing to do with me. I just know that they're a pretty kick-ass band. All right, so this was actually a lot of fun to just kind of write out, kind of put it together. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Please tell me what I got wrong. Please tell me what I got right. And who your choices would be for best decade of rock music. And what would be even more fun, like I said earlier, I want to hear who would be your final 4 and then winning band. All right, that wraps things up for this week's episode. I wanted to find a fun song to play to kind of just go with the topic. And 2 of my favorite bands that I have in my final 4, Foo Fighters, Led Zeppelin. I thought, what better way, what fun way to end the show than with the Foo Fighters covering a Led Zeppelin song. So that's what we're going to dive into right now. Make sure you crank this one up. Please like and subscribe, rate, review, tell your friends, all of those good things. Stay happy, stay healthy, stay safe, man, but most importantly, stay metal. We'll see you guys next time.
Been a long time since I rock and roll.
Hey, that's the show for this week. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Please make sure you hit that like and subscribe button. And join us here at the Thrill Me Podcast Network, where you can check out phenomenal shows like Haunter's Podcast, The Review at Rob Show, The Mr. Wonderful Show, and Core Memory on Live. We greatly appreciate you. And until next time, stay metal.